Hey, and welcome to this week's episode of the Inclusive Networker podcast. This is your host, Dr. Ramona, and who are we calling in to conversation today? Well, it is Melyssa Barrett. I am so excited to have Melyssa on the podcast. So let me tell you a little bit about her, and then we will start this conversation. So Melyssa Barrett is a certified diversity executive, is the CEO of Jolly Enterprises, Inc. Her professional expertise as a speaker, coach, consultant, and strategist is rooted in a passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion. She has dedicated her career to engaging communities and stakeholders. Oh, she is a girl after my own heart. For meaningful impact. With a background as a former vice president of Visa, I bring y'all the best. I bring you the best. She is a former vice president of Visa. Melyssa brings extensive experience in risk, data, security, business intelligence, and product. Her focus extends to establishing a center of excellence that encompasses all aspects of life cycles and operations, ensuring compliance with privacy, regulatory, and governance requirements while mitigating potential risks. So, Melyssa, I am so excited. Welcome to the Inclusive Networker podcast. I'm so glad to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Ramona. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so let's talk. The first thing that I always ask my guests is, what is your lens? It really helps us to know who you are, where you get your perspective. So tell us a little bit about your lens.
Yes, well, it's interesting because I was raised by a workaholic father who really kind of grew up and, his career developed. He worked at Xerox for most of my life. And my mother, being an immigrant from Panama, um, she moved around with him. She was a nurse. He worked at Xerox every 18 months for 13 years. We moved. And I mean, moved like they would buy the house and we would move to another state. So, as a child, I think that was very traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
As an older adult now, it makes it real easy for me to talk to people and to, just kind of step outside of my comfort zone. So that has been one of the things that's interesting. But my father also was very involved in the community always. My mother constantly by his side and making sure that the kids had everything that they needed, but work was very important. And so there was always a fight for justice. I remember being in elementary school and staying home from school to protest Martin Luther King, and try to make sure that that date became a holiday. That's my earliest memory of, making sure that I was involved. But my dad, ran for city council in, New York. And, he was kind of one of those all encompassing guys. And my mother, being a nurse, always was making sure that, the nurturing was there and that we had everything that we needed. But they were also like, you better get out and work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so for me, working became that thing. I always wanted to be, like, oh, I got to be independent. I want to make sure that I can do whatever it is I want to do because, my parents really empowered me to be that person. And so I always wanted to work in an office and, ended up working at financial institutions, Citibank, Wells Fargo, and the branch, and then moved up to, Visa and, worked there, literally starting as a receptionist and ending as the vice president of in the product organization. So it
I
was
see you. Yes.
it was an interesting journey for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So, it's so interesting when you have parents that are out just working in the community. And my parents did the same thing. They were, my dad, he in the civil rights era, he rolled a watermelon from
Oh,
Georgia to Philadelphia in protest for farmers, right? And so
oh
it's
my
like
goodness.
you
Yes.
start to just get this ingrained in you that this is something that I'm supposed to do. And it's so important that parents give that foundation. And that's the
Yes.
same thing with me. I just learned that you're supposed to do things in the community. You're supposed to be a public servant, right? And
Yes.
so I can completely identify with that. And so I also cheer you on for this rise through visa. So let's talk about that. So, okay. So when you talk about the things that you are your experience and what can you give the inclusive networker audience about your experience, your background, what you learned at Visa and how they develop infrastructure and community and all of that.
Yeah, Visa is a very interesting organization because when I started working there back in 1991,
Mhm.
they had 800 employees. And even at the time that I started working there, I mean, there was no way you could have told me 800 employees worldwide with the brand presence that they had. I mean, it was amazing to see what they were doing with
Mm,
so few human resources. But they were very intentional about what they did and how they did it. And to me, the global organization, what was amazing to me is they were very intentional about making sure that they were pulling in perspectives from all around the world. What was happening in Europe, what was happening in Africa and South Africa and different countries within Africa, what was happening in Asia, how can
mhm,
we make economies better. And so they were very intentional about how they created, committees. And they would bring in that global perspective to really try to
mm,
provide as much perspective as possible on economic outlook, as well as the infrastructure that they were creating, because they effectively are they are the network of networks. I mean, they are the
uh-huh.
largest network for payment transactions in the world.
Yeah.
So I think so that was one thing in terms of how they set up the infrastructure. It was unique in terms of how they got all of their financial institutions around the world to accept infrastructure, organization, operational regulations,
Mhm.
and while making sure that they're complying with all the laws of every country that they were in. And so I think what was effective is, as I think through now what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like, I see that they've created employee resource groups, but even before we had employee resource groups, we created our own communities. And
Uh-huh.
so we would just come together and create lunches or celebrate, whether it be Black History Month or, what Hispanic Heritage Month, whatever it was, we would actually create the communities we wanted to see. And I think a lot of times we think somebody else is supposed to create a community, but we can start. We can start with ourselves by just being self-aware and making sure that we begin to pull what we need. So I will say what was so important at Visa to me was the mentorship, and being able to really tap into people who were making that trajectory. They were making career moves. They understood the organization, And, just because you are part of a particular organization, you also have to be aware of what's going on around you. Those organizational changes that you see, they mean something and they make a difference. And you need to kind of tap into what is happening, why it's happening, and how it can be better. So don't be afraid of change. That's probably my biggest lesson at Visa, because it is a very dynamically changing company.
Mm-hmm.
But those are, don't be afraid of change. Make sure that you can receive it, understand it, and then activate what that change looks like for you and how you connect it to the goals of the company.
Mm-hmm. And so, as you're thinking about Visa and how they created community, because I love to think of things from a company perspective and from a consultant perspective when we're talking about network marketing. And so, what do you think made it where Visa really got this right? What did they do? And then with the team members or the employees, what is it that they were able to do? I know you said, making sure that they take initiative and doing those types of things. But what is it that they were able to do that made it work? And then it all just came together. And so let's look at it from Visa and then the employees themselves.
Yeah. And certainly I'm not a spokesperson for Visa, so I'm not saying they did everything
No.
right. I don't work there anymore.
Okay.
but but in my life, what I think they did right was they were really supportive. And I think over time the support became more significant, because I think we were trying to do things as employees in creating community, which was great, but you do want to have buy-in from the top. And when I say buy-in, I mean budget, I mean resources. Those things
That
make a
part.
huge difference.
Yes, that part. Okay, so
Right?
let's talk about that for a moment, because I think that a lot of times individuals in companies are frustrated
Yeah.
because they are trying to do this work. They are trying to, really make things happen with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at the grassroots level. And then they are told, yes, we support you, but there are no resources that are put behind it. It's not real time. They're cutting and slashing the DEI department. And so I think that's something that's important to point out, is that Visa said,
Absolutely.
okay, yes, we support you, but here is the true financial human resource support that
Right.
we are going to give you that backs up what we're saying, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it was interesting because, I think, one of the lessons I think we learned as an employee resource group is when your president starts asking you, okay, what do you want? You should have an answer.
Okay. Okay.
And so the question becomes, what do you need? What do you want? Through from an employee perspective, people want to be recognized. They want to be, they want to feel valued and included in
Mm-hmm.
conversations. And I think a lot of times we don't spend enough time on the human factor, which is really helping people understand where we want to go, and whether that's from a company or a network marketing perspective, people have to feel like they are buying into something.
Mm-hmm.
What is the vision for what you're trying to do, and why are you trying to do it? Purpose over profit.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure that we're effective in our communication and making sure that people understand, as you're building your network marketing, why are you building your network marketing? what
Mm-hmm.
what purpose is it, and what are you bringing? It's not just about making a profit. You want to make a difference because of what?
Mm-hmm.
And I
And then
think
when
those
we're
are, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so when we're having that conversation, I think that's so important to we can't skip by this part that you said if your president is coming to you and saying, "What do you need to have an answer, right?" And so
Yeah.
as we think through that piece, how did you all shape your answer in a way that it lined up with all of these big goals of Visa, and there was actually some action taken on what you said, right? So how do we do that in these
Yeah.
companies?
Well, and the way we formed it was we actually a bunch of us and we tried to get as many as possible came together on a regular basis, and we just started asking ourselves that question, like, what do we want? And then we realized that there were probably different perspectives of what we wanted. There were folks
Mhm,
that were maybe more in the professional independent contributor kind of roles that had a different perspective than, say, vice presidents and senior vice presidents and what they wanted. And so we started kind of, splitting those so that we could understand and identify, what do we need at maybe the higher level to be able to influence those that were professional development or individual contributor levels,
mhm,
um, so that we could actually bring people with us, right, as we moved
okay,
up throughout the company and had more influence. So we ended up with what we called our Black Executive Council. And that group kind of came together and defined three things that they were really focused on, specifically regarding, I think at the time it was, recruitment, retention, and self-care. And it
mm,
was, how do we make sure that we are taking care of ourselves, but then how do we make sure that we have a focus on the people who are here, the employees, and retaining them before we actually think about bringing in new people, right? Because at
mhm,
the end of the day,
that
you don't want to bring new
part.
people in and they're like, what is going on here, right? So,
Exactly, yes. And so I know a lot of people are like, "Well, we've tried to do different things. We tried to go to the management, the president, the CEO, and nothing's working. This doesn't work, whatever. Just we don't want to hear this anymore." So, what are some tips that you can give us? I know we just talked about how do you formulate the ask, and I think that that's a great way to do it. But what about these people that have been just doing this and they've been in the work and maybe their leadership isn't as receptive as Visa was?
well, and I think, and so as a lesson, I think you have to start always with being self-aware, because, you have control over your life. And I think a lot of people feel like they don't, and they have to do something that somebody else says or conform to a particular thing. And I'm all for, I do a lot with governance and requirements. So I understand you have to understand kind of the rails and then
Yeah.
determine how you want to break those rails or bend them accordingly.
Yeah.
So being
Okay.
self-aware, I think, is first, and then be intentional about what you need to break and the communication you need to have with those people who are not supporting you. Because quite frankly, there are lots of people, and I can go back to like the murder of George Floyd. There were so many people coming out of the woodwork that had no idea. They were just like, what? I didn't know.
Yeah.
Um, and everybody's lived experience is different. Some people, they just don't get it until somebody brings it appropriately and helps them understand. And
Mhm.
I'm not saying that always needs to be us. But there has to be some intentionality that
Yeah.
allows people to be educated.
Mhm.
And then create some communities. I in my career, I had to be very creative. You know, when you work at a corporation, you don't always get the budgeting or the funding that you need.
Mm-hmm.
Get creative. And whether that's, you know, creating and tapping into communities that you might not consider, there are partnerships you can create. There are things that you can do in the community that tap into nonprofits or, you know, other people's purpose, so that you all have a common goal, that maybe provides a little bit more pressure for those in senior leadership, because the brand is always impactful, and so
Mm-hmm.
you always want to make sure that there are opportunities for you to tap into, purpose.
Yeah, yeah, that is really good. And so, as we think about this pushing the envelope that you're talking about, like how do we stay in the rules? How do we understand the box that we're in, but then also be able to think outside the box and work outside the box as well? So think through that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and I think that comes with a lot of, just real focused awareness. So I'll give you an example of something that we did that, there are so many things that have never been done before, in
Mm-hmm.
whatever organization that you're working in. You are creating the history as you go, but the vision needs to be there. So I think one of the things that we spent time working on was, we had a community, right? The employee resource group was our community, but we said, how can we take that community to another level? And so what we ended up doing was pulling together a Black leadership summit, where, all across the United States, we pulled in those that were self-identified African American, and we had a conference. And
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you, it was the most motivating, for those individuals to feel heard. I mean, the CEO of the company was there, and I think we got to know the CEO at the time differently than what we saw, as he walked through the hallways. It was a
Mm-hmm.
very different conversation. It was very intimate because, unfortunately, there weren't thousands of us there, but it was intimate enough to really be able to have conversations and pull people together, so that
Mm-hmm.
we could leave there with some actionable items. And it didn't stop there. I mean, obviously, you need the buy-in of senior leadership, middle management. We all have the opportunity to impact our own climate. And when we think about the culture of our organization, we also can understand that the worst thing that a person does in leadership, sets the bar. So
Mm-hmm.
if that senior leader is saying one thing and doing another, that's the bar you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes really important for those listening opportunities, to make sure that individuals from various backgrounds, really expand your ability to understand, what other people are thinking, and
Mm-hmm.
how they're thinking, even if you don't agree, quite frankly, because it gives you that understanding of, okay, this is where I am and this is where they are, and then you define where your life needs to go.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes, I love that. Yeah. So as we're thinking about networking and building community, what are some last tips that you can give us that come from your experience, whether it's with Visa or just doing the DEI work or anything else that you can give the inclusive networker community?
yeah, honestly, it's probably nothing you haven't heard before, but to me, there's always a focus on people, relationships, relatability. Some of the things I heard from, my husband who passed away, 6 years ago. One of the things that I loved about him is he knew everybody's history. So if he just met you for the first time, he was curious about who you were, where you came from, because
Yes.
he probably knew your history sometimes
Better
better
than
than you
you.
do. But he could relate to anyone, because whether you were, Greek or, from South Africa or, wherever, he could give you lots of nuggets about, where you came from, and the type of people that, you came from, in terms of their strength, their story. And so in terms of just, some of the actionable things, I would say, just make sure that you are open and looking to attend diverse network events, because I think that's really important. Intentionally learn about different cultures, and get curious. Do some research about people's history, and don't be afraid to go into neurodiversity, because I think a lot of times, and a lot of people don't have the language. I look back on things and I go, wow, I didn't realize they were probably neurodiverse, in even in my own family. And it actually helps you understand them more, because they have a different perspective. And then, I think just being able to collaborate with diverse groups, get out in your community and, kind of bend those rules a bit when it comes to how are you going to impact the community in a way that actually makes a difference. And so whether it be, in my case, it could be financial education, it could be, working in the community. I mean, going to a city council meeting and a school board, you know, praise the Lord, there is work to be done on the community
So much
level.
work. Yes.
But as you think about building the network, you need to just really be intentional about what it is that you are proposing. So I would say, when you're thinking about your own infrastructure as a network marketer, you have control of your network. And what you decide is tolerable. If there are people making jokes and you tolerate that, that is what your network looks like. And so just be aware of the bar that you're setting for your network, and be intentional and be excellent at it.
That's good. Oh, I love that. That is just, yes. Oh, okay. So, Melyssa, just tell us, where can we find you? I know that the Inclusive Networker audience is going to want to keep in touch with you after this. So where do we find you? What's your next big theme? What do we need to plug into?
So I'm on social media, Melyssa Barrett. I spell it a little funny, as Dr. Ramona knows. I also have a Y, MELYSSABARRETT.com. And you can find me, Melyssa Barrett, on Instagram and Facebook and all over the place as well, TikTok and all of that. Um, but in terms of my next big thing, I would say, I do spend a lot of time focusing on digital infrastructure. And, as I think about infrastructure, we think about smart cities and municipalities that are trying to recreate the infrastructure. Instead of freeways, we're thinking about how do we get, internet and fiber into, different cities and suburbs where it doesn't exist, because those communities will not be able to thrive without it.
Yep. Yeah.
And in many cases, they're in opportunity zones or neglected communities, that maybe had previously been redlined. And then we wonder why we don't have the wealth effect going on, because, we've been restricted. And so, those are the things that we're working on to make sure that we can bring public and private sectors together, but also create the rules and governance around how to protect consumers or citizens, so that they have the structure that they need, especially with respect to privacy and other things like that. So regulation, all of those things. So that's what we work on next.
That is some awesome work. And I think it's so important when we think about creating equity in these communities. And we often say, well, why are they not thriving? Just like you said, it's like they don't have all of the resources that they need to reach the top. And so I love the work that you're doing. And I'm so excited to keep in touch with you, Melyssa. So thank you so much for coming on this episode of the Inclusive Networker podcast. And thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the Inclusive Networker. And you will find my guests show information in the show notes. And so what you need to do is go and look for her there, look for her on social media. And I will see you on the next episode of the Inclusive Networker. Bye.